So just because I'm a little bit short on time, this video is going to be a little bit more conversational. It's going to be kind of more just cutting straight to the point, I guess, with the content. I apologise. We will resume our regular programming at a later date. So we're first going to look at the two-step flow model of audience effects. Now, this basically, at its root, says that actually interpersonal relationships between people has a much greater effect on people than any kind of mass media does. But essentially this comes from Katz and Lazarsfeld in 1965. They argued that the audience is actually rather active, and they are often influenced by influential opinion leaders rather than directly by media content. These will be people within their lives which they trust with an interpretation of the world. Katz and Lazarsfeld argued that social networks were dominated by these opinion leaders, who were basically influential people within social networks with the power to influence how others around them saw the world. Opinion leaders first get exposed to the media content which they then interpret for their wider audience. Thus, media content goes through two stages, with the wider audience being primarily influenced by the views of the opinion leaders rather than being influenced directly by the media content itself. Now let's consider the merits of this argument. First, we can suggest on the positive side that the two-step flow model recognises that most people watch media as part of a social network. And it also might be especially useful for understanding the role of parents as opinion leaders and major people within the lives of individuals who may be granted more influence than others. However, there are a couple of criticisms that can be made of the two-step flow model. If it's true that the media is having a direct effect on the opinion leaders, then actually it could be argued that there's still some validity in the hypodermic syringe model, just indirectly. Because if the media is having a direct effect on the opinion leaders, and then in turn the people who are influenced by the opinion leaders, then surely the media is still having the direct effect of the hypodermic syringe model, just in a slightly different way. But also this model may not apply to people who are socially isolated, who don't have any opinion leaders in their lives. And actually these are the people who could be most likely to be influenced by media content because they don't have someone to process the information that they receive with. The next one we need to look at is called the cultural effects model of audience effects, which is often associated with the neo-Marxist position in some way. According to the cultural effects model, the media contains ideological messages that are often reflecting the values of media owners and professionals who basically expect audiences to agree with their preferred readings of events. Now, as we know, the vast majority of media owners and professionals tend to be from the middle or upper class, and so actually points of view which are oppositional to this kind of class of people are generally kept out of the mainstream media through processes such as agenda setting and gatekeeping. Agenda setting is essentially when the media chooses the priority of things that it reports on in the news, therefore basically trying to manipulate people's views of what is and isn't important. And then we have gatekeeping, which is actually just a process in which information is filtered by the media when it gets to the public. Basically, when the media determines what information is selected, but also the nature of the content and the tone of the issue being raised. It is through those two processes that audiences are continually exposed to the dominant ideology, and this has a gradual drip effect, and over time audiences come to share the views of the rich and powerful. They also come to dislike many of the people who are demonized by the ideological elite, such as immigrants or those on benefits, serving the needs of capitalism. But it isn't the same as the hypodermic syringe model. They do argue that audiences are active and they do interpret media content in many diverse and different ways. But they argue that the possible interpretations that people can make are very narrow because the ideological frame of the bourgeoisie has narrowed so that people can only essentially make a certain amount of interpretations. But there have been some criticisms of this model. For starters, on a methodological basis, it is difficult to test any theory on long-term media effects. It is almost impossible to isolate the independent effect that long-term exposure to media content has had over several years, because in theory, the effects are so minute that they would be immeasurable. So actually, it's not a really provable theory. But also, it seems increasingly unlikely that homogeneous content has homogeneous effects in the postmodern age of new media. Although we might be receiving a lot of the same information, the interpretations that we provide of that can actually be infinite according to postmodernists. So actually, it's not going to have the same effect on everyone, despite what they say. Our final one was actually made by Lazarsfeld, the same one who actually proposed the two-step flow model. But before he actually signed up to this model, he was convinced in what he called limited effects theory. And this theory is actually relatively simple. It just states that even if there is an effect created by the media on the thoughts and opinions of individuals, the effect is minimal at best, or just limited. Now, studies were done in the 1940s and 50s to actually examine the validity of this. And they specifically looked at the ability of media to influence voting, and found that well-informed people relied more on personal experience, prior knowledge, and their own reasoning to inform their vote. However, that said, media experts more likely swayed those who were less informed. So much of it does depend on the level of prior information that someone has before they turn to the media for their information. But critics do point to two problems with the limited effects model. First, they will argue that actually the theory ignores the media's role in framing and limiting the discussion and the debate of issues. How the media frames a debate and what questions that members of the media ask can change the outcome of the discussion and the possible conclusions that people may draw. If you only have a certain amount of questions to choose from, then you will only get a certain amount of answers. So there must be some degree of large-scale effect taking place. But secondly, this theory came into existence when actually the availability and the dominance of media was far less widespread. In the 1940s and 50s, we were talking about a time in which many people still didn't have a television in their home. So actually, we're talking about a very different period. Today, everyone has access to the media and in many ways has access to it all of the time. So really, it's a very different and possibly outdated theory.